Hey everyone, this is Andrew from Team Secret, and today I've got a video for you all on choosing a deck to play. So the question is, what deck should I play? I get asked this question almost every day from people that I play with casually, to friends that I play with for a while, to even experienced players that are not sure, what deck they want to take to an event. Um, and it's a really good question, and this video is not going to focus on, a specific meta or anything like that. It's just a little bit more like, kind of like game theory, like think about how, you approach like what deck you want to invest a lot of time in, what are your goals and things like that. So let's jump into it. So right now, I will snapshot this by saying that we are in set 4. We're post all the sectors and regionals, so we still have a decent amount of time until set 5 drops. We did just get all the set 5 spoilers. I'm not going to get into specifics of that in this video. We do have another video coming out next week where we talk about the set 5 leaders, so definitely check that out. But this is going to be kind of more broad based. But as an example, post Django and the Triple Dark Raid and DJ suspensions, the meta has been very wide open, and it's continued to be that way with some minor changes here and there, some hot decks popping up like Ray Data Vault, things like that. But so far, it seems like there are a lot of options, which is an exciting time to play, right? There's many more options than in set 3, and we anticipate with set 5 coming out that there will continue to be even more choices for players. So in this video, we'll talk about competitive play, but I won't get into like stats, right, or matchups, percentages, things like that. That'll be in a different video. This is much more like just kind of high level, like how do we think about, what deck we want to go with. Like I mentioned before, this is, I get asked this question all the time, and that's kind of why I wanted to make the video, right? Uh, when people ask me like, oh, what deck should I take to this PQ or a Store Showdown? It's like, I don't really know. I don't want to, tell someone to take a deck and they take it and they don't like it or they don't have fun with it or whatever. So I kind of, wanted to think about like, okay, well, what decisions do I make when I, gravitate towards a specific deck after I've tested a bunch of options? It can definitely be intimidating, right? There's so many leaders, different combinations. What color do you pair with? Do you have any out of aspect cards? What's the sideboard look like? I mean, there's so many decisions to make, and it's kind of like, where do I start? I feel this way, especially at like the start of a set, right? You're like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff that we're excited to test and try out, but we got to start somewhere. And this, I think, is even harder for players that are just getting into the game, right? Like, I've talked to people that are like, oh, I'm going to my first Store Showdown. What do I bring? Like, I want, they want like something competitive, but like something they're going to enjoy playing and something that ticks a lot of their boxes, right? Of what they would like to do in the game. And yeah, we'll look at it together. Okay, so step 1, I like to think about like, why am I playing the game, right? So this sounds like, this is like silly or whatever, but bear with me. Oh, whoops, I accidentally clicked back on that one. So I'm just gonna go over some possible options here, right? From things I've observed in myself and other people, and just kind of various reasons why we might play Star Wars Unlimited or any game really, for that matter. So one thing is like trying every possible deck. For instance, I know some people that really enjoy switching it up every single event or every few events or whatever, right? There's something we said about variety, and it's definitely fun to kind of mix it up and try something new, especially if you feel like it's something that's getting stale for you, or you feel like you have performed well with a deck and you're not learning as much. Having fun, right? We're playing a game, and we want to have fun, and it's kind of like a balance when we go to an event, right? Like, do you want to play the deck that is the most fun or the most competitive, or try to find something in the middle, and kind of how do we think about that? Maybe you have goals in the game, like winning a Store Showdown I have listed right here, or something else. Learning and improving, right? So practicing the matchups, learning the play lines, learning the sideboarding, learning like the mirror, for example. The mirror for a lot of decks can be very kind of granular in the weeds, like very ticky-tack and figuring out little individual minutia. Playing something off meta, some people get a real kick out of playing something that's not meta or something really out there, or they want to surprise their opponents, or it's just a leader that they really like and it's not necessarily like on everybody's radar. Traveling to events, going to, for example, one of the sectors or regionals or a planetary qualifier or whatever. Playing against great players, right? There's a lot of really great players in this game that are super talented, and it's definitely fun to play against them and meet them at these events. Okay, so I took that giant list. Let me just rewind actually real quick. So I went through this and I thought about some other things and I just came up with my own answers, right? And there's no like right or wrong here. I think the way I tried to look at it though was like everything can't be of equal importance, right? So like, if you had to rank everything, so to speak, some things are going to edge out other things, right? So for me, when I really thought about this, number one for me is having fun, right? So, I like to play the game competitively, like a lot of other players. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's kind of like, well, are you really trying to have fun? Can you have fun and play, a competitive deck? And I think the answer is yes. But it really depends on like, where we're ranking these things, right? And for me, it's having fun. So if I only really want to play a deck, a leader, a list that I enjoy playing. At the end of the day, it's like we're playing a game, and if I'm not having fun at all, I'm not going to play the game. Even if, the most polarizing example, right, is if you had a choice between like all the meta decks that were competitive, and like another list over here of all the decks that you personally enjoyed, and like there was no crossover, right? Um, yeah, I just like would not play in that meta, I think, or go to that event, because you know you're at these events for a long time. You're playing a lot of matches. You're playing a lot of rounds, and I think for me, when I think about the decks that I like and the cards that I like and the interactions and all that kind of stuff, at the end of the day, like it is fun, and that's like very motivating for me, like when I'm playing, even in these competitive events. Yeah, basically covered that in here. So number two, learning and improving, right? So this is especially important, I think, for people that don't have a ton of TCG experience, myself included, right? So, aside from dabbling back in the day with Magic and some other stuff, I mostly came from like board games and video games and like game design and game development background. So this is really like the first TCG that I have played competitively. So it's been about a year now, right? So I basically have way less TCG experience than all of my friends, all of the people we play against, I would say. So for me, it's not just of value of like, okay, I want to learn and improve and focus on that. It's also like very important for me to be able to, compete against some of these really good players that have a ton of experience. So what does that mean? So expectation setting, and I have mini games here. So, you know, as an example, like, if I'm playing an event, if you lose a match, let's say, like that's disappointing. Everyone is disappointed if they lose a match. Um, but fixating on that doesn't really help, right? So if our value is learning and improving, or my value, I should say, is learn and improve, then my expectation is I'm going to play well, or play as well as I can, try to minimize mistakes, try to, get a feel for whatever game I'm in. And so it's almost like a mini game, right? Like I'm not really trying to play to win that individual game or match. I'm trying to play as well as I can and then reflect on how I played after the fact and improve that going forward, right? So that way that you're going to win some games, you're going to lose some games, you're going to win some matches, you're going to lose some matches. Um, I lost in the finals of 2 planetary qualifiers in game threes, which was, heartbreaking. Um, but then at the end of the day, I learned a lot from those experiences, and those experiences made me a better player, right? But if all I did was fixate and ruminate on like, oh, I lost, I got so close and I lost and this sucks, like that doesn't really like help me like improve going forward, right? So that's very important to me personally. So going back to the last list, like having goals, right? So I just used the one I had on the list of winning a store showdown, for example. So like having a goal is good, right? But I ranked this below learning and improving on my list, right? Because again, if I don't achieve the goal, then that's okay as long as I'm learning and improving and having fun, because those are more important. So having goals are definitely important for me, but it's less important than the other two things. And I think that's kind of affects like your mindset and like how you play the game and approach the game, right? And again, going back to playing well, right? So it's like my real goal is just playing well, and whether I win or lose, that's more important. Playing against great players, so being able to go to a planetary qualifier, or we just went to Minneapolis for the regional qualifier, playing against other really great players. Super fun, super great experience. Also just like the social element of like making friends and like being able to chat with these people about the game, and they're all like super smart and really nice people. That's a really big component of like why I enjoy playing Star Wars Unlimited. And yeah, I cover that here. Okay, so that's kind of the why, or the why, and then step two is kind of looking at like what qualities do I like in a deck, right? So I'm just going to go through again, just list a bunch of them, and we can go over them. So burn, like aggro, damage to base, trying to end the game quickly. The card that comes to mind is For a Cause I Believe In, right? Just damage to base, finish the game. Stealing my opponent's units, I guess like Palpatine, you could say. Value, like value trading, 2-for-1s, things like that. Going base, I guess that kind of ties into burn, but maybe you could be more unit based or whatever. Fighting for board, so like trading units, kind of getting into more of mid range aspects there. Competitive against aggro, so that's kind of more like do you want to be like more heavier top end, or like a little bit lower to the ground, depending on whether you're a mid range deck or another aggro deck. Playing bigger units, right? Like, playing bomb units that are, can take over the game. Like, that's exciting. Drawing a billion cards. There are a lot of card draw is, I guess, it's okay in Star Wars Unlimited because we're drawing 2 cards a turn. But, there are some decks that can still draw a lot of cards and get a lot of value out of it. Fiddly abilities and interactions, like thinking about like trying to think of a good example here. Like I'll just say Inferno 4 comes to mind. Like abilities like that give you some choices. Can set up your next round, things like that. Having lots of options, right? So cards that have multiple different options, like for example home 1 comes to mind, right? When you play home 1, you get to look in your discard pile and bring a card back, and depending on how late in the game we are, there could be 10 15 cards in your discard pile, right? So you have a lot of choices with certain cards. Playing a ton of cheap units, going wide, kind of ties back into aggro, but it can be more mid-range, like Ray Data Vault comes to mind, right? Like they're just playing like a ton of guys like on the board. All right, so again, similar to the why slide, I went through and just picked what is important to me, like what I value in a deck, and no pun intended, but yeah, number one for me is value. So value meaning what exactly? Like playing, cards that can either like defeat a unit and then leave something around, or draw cards, or create some kind of like advantage, like on the board, right? Um, so we'll just say Darth Vader as an example from Spark of Rebellion. You know, you play him, you ambush something, you defeat a smaller unit, you search, top 10 cards of your deck, you can pull one or two units out, and suddenly you've just done a whole bunch of actions just by playing one card. Lots of options. So, we mentioned like Inferno 4, like card filtering, even going back to Vader, the example I just gave, Vader has the option, you can choose to resolve the ambush first, the search first, deciding what you're going to find when you're searching, and that can all kind of change based on the board state. And certain cards give you more flexibility, like Vader or Home One, like we discussed. Fighting for board. So trading units, you know, like basically like ideally making some value trades and then transitioning to going base, right? As opposed to like an aggro deck is, trying to just go base at every opportunity. I would, I enjoy kind of like figuring out like, okay, how can I kind of set the board up a little bit in my favor and then start to go base. Competitive against aggro. So this kind of goes back to like, how heavy top end do you want your deck to be? So I would rather be like leaner and have like, a good matchup into Sabine, like be as competitive as I can into Sabine, or let's say jump to Lightspeed Vader, or aggro decks in general. Playing bigger units. So, we talked about some in this slide so far, like Vader, Home One. Some of the bombs, like ramping into bombs, that's just fun for me. I like playing a lot of these bigger cards. Not like, I'm not talking about like too big, like Annihilator, nothing like that. But like, some of the force units like Vader, Maul, going up to like Avenger as like the top end. And then I think this is my last one, fiddly abilities interactions. So this kind of goes back to like lots of options, but being able to like resolve things in certain ways. Like Darth Vader as an example. One of the lines you have with him is you have Death Trooper in the deck. So Death Trooper can deal 2 damage to something. Vader ambushes for 5. So if you find Death Trooper with Vader, you can set up a 7 damage uh, uh, attack on a unit, basically, right? So you can defeat like a Luke Skywalker or a leader with 7 health, like Quinlan Voss or things like that. But you have to like, that's interesting because it's like, it's not just like Darth Vader does this thing. It's you have to set up your deck building process in a certain way to have a chance to have this outcome that you want. Sorry, let me go back real quick. So let's like kind of just break this down a little bit. So now that we've got all of them here, so for me again, like value, like having some value trades in there, I like that. Uh, Having lots of options, fighting for board, being lean, playing bigger units, and having some interactions down there. So if we just look at the top 3, for example, like value trades, lots of options, fighting for board. So this is already kind of like looking kind of like mid-rangey, right? And we'll get into kind of like where that sort of nudges us going forward. So step 3 is like, what skills do I have, right? So it's kind of like assessing yourself, right? So, like, why do we need to do this? So if step 1 is why are we playing? Step 2 is what do we like playing? Step 3 is like, what are we good at, right? So if you kind of picture like a Venn diagram, right, of those 3 things, that's sort of like what we're trying to assess here. So we've gone over the why. Why am I playing? What's important to me? What do I like? And now it's what can I actually bring to, my deck and the game. So again, just going to list a bunch of here. So mathing, mathing out like this round, sequencing like how much damage can I deal to the base or to their units based off what happens and what are my options. Mathing out over the next several rounds, like how many attacks do I need to win the game, and then factoring in like, well, what if they remove one of my units or I draw poorly or whatever. That's like very important, especially in Star Wars Unlimited where it's one action per person, right? So you can't just like do a bunch of actions all at once. Deck building, right? So, some people really enjoy deck building more than others, and some people are like super talented deck builders. Some people are very creative deck builders. A bunch of different players come to mind. Some people really pride themselves on like being very good deck builders, and that's definitely a skill. Piloting, right? On the flip side, some people are just like, give me a deck, and I'll take it. So most people are somewhere in the middle, right? Some people really love deck building. Some people really love piloting. Most people can, do some of both. But if it's sort of like a spectrum of one end deck building, the other end piloting, some people might be, dead in the middle or kind of, maybe closer to one of the other sides. Aggro, so just, being able to, this kind of ties into the first one with mathing, but like, how to push as much damage as possible, how to sequence things as efficiently as possible, being able to get initiative when you need it, figuring out the least amount of actions you need to deal lethal damage to their base, knowing when you maybe need to take a value trade in order to, remove like a restore unit, for example, things like that. Value trading, flip side of that, so more mid-rangey, like, instead of aggro saying, well, my default is go base, but I may have to value trade sometimes, on the opposite side, you need to value trade maybe as a default with a slower deck, but you need to know when to turn the corner and start going base and pushing damage. Matchup knowledge, right? So, how competent are you at piloting mirrors, right? Do you have a sense of, well, I think I have a 50-50 matchup here, but this matchup over here is quite difficult, and this one over here feels a little bit more in my favor. Kind of understanding all the nuances there. Sideboarding. Sideboarding is a big one. Something off the top of my head, one of my teammates, Josh, he was really into the Jump to Lightspeed Vader yellow aggro deck, and I didn't really have a good sense of how that matchup went. And so we tested, and as an example, like I realized after discussing this with him that I needed to board in all 10 cards of my sideboard, which is very strange and feels weird, but for that specific matchup, that was actually like the correct move. So each matchup's a little different, and knowing what to sideboard, when to sideboard, do you change it up between, games 2 and 3? Is it always the same? Feel for the meta. So kind of going back to the last two related to that, like, feeling for like your sideboard and like your matchup knowledge. This is broader base, like how do you approach the meta? How do you feel like things are trending? Are there any like hot decks coming out? And some of this is intuitive. Some people are very stats driven, right? So there's different kind of approaches to this. Okay, so that's all of those. And then similarly, I ranked my answers. So I kind of broke this down into like strengths and weaknesses. So strengths, board management. So just kind of, understanding like the flow of like the early game and like, if units start to stack up on the board, I feel like having a sense of like what, I can trade or when I need to push damage to base. Matchup knowledge. Fortunately, I've got a lot of really talented players that I playtest with, and so I feel like any matchup that I don't feel super comfortable with, I can find someone that is really skilled with that deck and say, hey, do you mind we play some games together? And we jam some games, and then I can get a lot of practice against that deck with a very experienced player. Planning out several rounds in advance, so thinking about, okay, so here's the few things that I could do this round. What's my opponent going to do? And then thinking about the next round. Okay, these are the few things that I could do depending on what I draw. What are they going to do based on what they draw? Some of the weaknesses. Math. So kind of the flip side of like the last one under strengths, planning out several rounds in advance. So like the planning out several rounds in advance, I feel comfortable doing from like a card perspective, right? Like trying to predict what they're going to play, what I'm going to play, how they're going to interact and play off each other. But math is definitely not my strong suit. Like I've missed lethal more times than I can count. I've mismathed out like, okay, I'm going to take 4 rounds to deal lethal damage here, but it ended up being 3 or 5 or whatever. That's just something that I am not as good at, and that's okay. Identifying that within yourself, and then trying to just be aware of it helps a lot, I think. Deck building. So I would say if we're going back to a continuum where deck building's on one side and piloting is on the other, I'm more on like the piloting side, right? Like I feel really comfortable piloting a deck that I've gotten a lot of reps on. Deck building, I'm a little bit slower, I would say, compared to most people that I play with or that I'm friends with. I think once I talk to them about it and I kind of see where they're going, I can like tweak a deck and I can sort of take a deck from like point A to point B and make a bunch of changes. But just starting at 0 with like a new archetype or something, or a totally new leader or whatever, I think it just takes me a while to kind of get a good feel for it. I definitely rely kind of on some of my friends, people in the community for new archetype ideas as like a jumping off point. Context switching, between decks. So when I mentioned that I feel comfortable like piloting a deck with a lot of reps, the inverse of that is true. So if I take something to an event that I have relatively no reps on, like I don't feel super comfortable on it. So I need to like practice at locals or jam some games with friends, right? And once I do that, then I feel like very good on it. But some of my friends or teammates can like pick up a new deck and just like roll with it like the next day. I can't do that. So I definitely need some practice, some reps, some context for that deck, and then I feel really confident on it. And so kind of identifying these things like being aware of like your individual strengths and weaknesses can help you improve as a player, right? And so you can kind of shore up your weaknesses and sort of be aware of them, and you can kind of double down on your strengths. Okay, so step 4, putting it all together. So we covered the why, we covered the what, and we covered how, I guess you can put it that way. So why are we playing the game? What are we looking to play in our decks? And then what do we feel like we can proficiently pilot, right? So for me, that's being a mid-range player, right? So like, you could say Star Wars Unlimited is mostly mid-range. Sure, that's fine. There's like, Sabine on the aggro side of things, and there's like, Bosk Blue, like hard control, and pretty much everything else is like in the middle, I guess you could argue. But there's like, there's still like, I would consider a bunch of aggro decks, right? And then you kind of have like Palpatine and some other stuff like on the farther end of the spectrum. But yeah, I like kind of playing somewhere like right in the middle. So, getting a couple value trades and then trying to turn the corner and go base. That's fun for me. In set 1, I played Tarkin, and that was kind of about like, removing a couple units, putting some experience down, and then trying to close the game out. And that was just a lot of fun. And I've kind of, mostly stuck to like, decks that are roughly trying to do that game plan, I would say. So as an example, we'll get into specifics on this slide, but in terms of playtesting, practicing, I've played everything, right? So, when a set comes out, just like a lot of people, it's really fun to try all the leaders, all the different decks, even if it's not something that, I could see myself playing a lot of. It's still really fun just to try everything, test all the different combinations and all that good stuff. But when it comes to like, investing a lot of time into a deck and taking it to an event, Kira and Quinlan are two decks that I gravitated towards. So let's look at Kira. So Kira, she's got a bunch of, qualities that I like, but one of them is she's lower to the ground, right? So she deploys on 5, even though she's like, you could say a more board control-y leader, right? There are other control-y leaders in this game, like Palpatine, Spark of Rebellion, Darth Vader. I mean, there's a bunch of them. But she comes out sooner, right? And especially if you ramp, she can deploy on round 3, right? So she lets you kind of like fight for board. She comes out early. That to me is fun. There are lots of value cards, not for like Kira leader specifically, but like in her shell. So villain, blue green. Some of the cards he talked about, like Darth Vader, Inferno 4. A lot of these cards are just like can create like a 2-for-1 situation, help you stabilize the board, and those cards are just super fun for me to play with. Okay, so Quinlan. So very kind of different in a lot of ways. So Quinlan is more like, I consider him kind of more aggro-y, especially in the current iteration of the deck. But for Quinlan, it's like you just get to play like really powerful cards, right? Powerful cards that are like not that expensive for the most part. Cards like Force Throw, Spark of Rebellion, Millennium Falcon, Cassian Andor, Guerrilla Soldier. Surprise Strike. The list goes on. That whole deck is literally just a pile of just really, really, really strong cards. And when I first started playing Quinlan, it was very different than like Kira, for example. She's more mid-range and slower. Quinlan has a lot of different interesting things that he can do. You can be aggro and just go base. You can take a more board control-y approach, which you often have to do against like Sabine, for example, because Sabine's faster than Quinlan. With cards like Force Throw, Ahsoka Tano, Kira Unit, things like that. And him being aggro tempo, like for me, that was a lot of fun to learn. Like in the fact that like he could be very aggressive and kind of close the game out quickly, but there were a lot of like tempo options. You get to run a lot of really good cunning cards like Bamboozle and things like that. So there were a lot of even though he's much more aggressive than Kira, there were a lot of similarities. Like you have to kind of know when you're like the aggro or when you have to play a little bit of tempo, or you have to go like full kind of like board control-y while you chip at them, depending on the matchups. Okay, so thanks for watching. And to recap, this video is not gonna dive into a specific meta or anything like that. We'll have plenty more content for all that going forward. But this was just more of a very general, kind of high level, like thought experiment that like I do for when I approach like a new deck if I want to invest time into it. And I hope this is helpful. And if you get a chance, like, subscribe, and take care.